Sagittarius, the karmic door has closed, and you didn't even look back. When you no longer turn around, there was a time, Sagittarius, when endings in your life came tangled with chaos. Sharp words, heavy silences, and the exhausting cycle of hope, disappointment, and forgiveness. You've known what it's like to wait for someone to keep a promise they made in their brightest moments but abandoned in their darkest. You've known what it's like to keep opening the same door, thinking this time will be different, only to find the same shadows waiting on the other side. But this time was different. When the final door closed, you didn't rush to wedge your foot in before it shut. You didn't cry outside it, waiting for it to open again. You didn't even reach for the handle. You let it close and you kept walking, not because your heart had hardened, but because your soul had finally awakened. There was no grand scene, no dramatic farewell. Just a quiet, steady certainty that the chapter had ended, and that nothing in you was willing to reopen it. You know now what you didn't before. Some endings are not a loss but a release. A karmic cycle, the kind that keeps you spinning in the same loop until you learn the lesson, has finally run its course. And for the first time, you're not looking back to see if they're watching you leave. You're not glancing over your shoulder to check if they regret what they lost. Your gaze is forward, toward the horizon that feels wider than it has in years. This is not detachment born of indifference. It's the kind of freedom that blooms when you've loved deeply enough to recognize when love has stopped being love. It's the kind of clarity that feels like standing in sunlight after months of gray skies. The karmic door has closed behind you, and for the first time, the sound of it doesn't hurt. Feels like peace. Gate 1. You once found yourself pulled into the loops of karma. There are some people, Sagittarius, whose presence feels magnetic, not in the surface-level way that makes your heart race for a week, but in the deep, almost inexplicable way that seems to pull at the threads of your soul. You can't fully explain why you're drawn to them. You just are. And no matter how many times your mind says this is hurting me, your heart whispers maybe next time it will be different. You've lived that loop before. The kind where hurt is followed by hope, where disappointment is washed over by forgiveness, where forgiveness feels like love, but is really just another lap around the same circle. You told yourself that it was compassion, that it was loyalty, that it was strength. And to a degree it was, because only a strong heart can choose to keep showing up after being bruised. But here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Karma is not healed by blind endurance. Karmic cycles are like old fraying ropes. They bind you not because you want to stay, but because the part of you that is still wounded believes there's something on the other side worth the pain. Every time you step back in, you weren't just forgiving them. You were trying to rewrite the ending, to turn this story into one where love wins simply because you refuse to give up. And yet, karmic stories don't close that way. They close when you see them for what they are. Not epic love tales, but soul contracts meant to teach you something. I remember a man I once spoke with. He had been in love with a woman who, by his own admission, broke him open and broke him down over and over again. Every time they fought, every time she betrayed his trust, he would tell himself that her love was worth the storm. She's my mirror, he said. And he was right, but not in the way he thought. She was his mirror because she reflected the very parts of himself he had been avoiding. His need for validation, his fear of being alone, his belief that love had to be earned through suffering. It wasn't until he saw that clearly, until he understood that she was the lesson, not the destination, that he finally stepped away. Sagittarius, that's what karmic loops do. They draw you back, not to heal the relationship, but to heal you. They keep placing the same test in front of you until you recognize that the only way to pass is to put the test down entirely. You've been there, loving so much that you thought love alone would change everything. You overlooked the missed calls, the broken promises, the small ways they let you down, telling yourself that your patience would inspire them to rise. You thought that if you gave enough, they would give more. But each return to the loop cost you a piece of yourself. A little less joy, a little less trust in your own intuition, a little less faith that love could feel easy. And then one day something shifted. Not because of something they did, but because of something you finally saw. You saw the pattern. You saw that you had been here before, and that the scenery might change, a different argument, a different excuse, a different promise, but the road was always the same. And suddenly it wasn't magnetic anymore. It was predictable. And predictability is the opposite of magic. When you reach that moment, the karmic pull weakens. The rope doesn't snap, it unravels thread by thread, until you are no longer bound by the need to see it through. You can still love them, still wish them well, and still walk away. Because love without freedom isn't love. It's a transaction where you keep paying in pieces of yourself. That's the lesson the karmic door closing has left you with. Not every soul is meant to stay forever. Some enter your life to ignite the deepest lessons, to bring dormant wounds to the surface so you can finally face them. And once that lesson is learned, holding on to them doesn't extend the love. It extends the pain. It's not weakness to release a karmic tie. It's the bravest act you can commit to, because when you close that door, you're not just letting go of them, you're letting go of the version of yourself that needed to keep the door open in the first place. And that, Sagittarius, is where your real freedom begins. Gate 2, the ending didn't come from an explosion, but from within. Some endings arrive like storms, loud, dramatic, leaving debris in their wake. But this one didn't. There was no lightning strike, no single betrayal that tipped the scale, no public unraveling that left you picking up the pieces in front of others. Instead, the ending came like the changing of a season, gradual, almost invisible, until one day you realized the air was different, and you could no longer pretend it was the same. You were sitting next to them, perhaps even laughing at something small, and yet there was an unfamiliar quiet inside you. A quiet that wasn't peace, but distance. You heard their voice, but it was like hearing it from another room. You watched their lips move, but your heart didn't leap the way it used to. The tether between you hadn't snapped violently. It had simply loosened until it slipped from your hands entirely. That's the thing about real endings, Sagittarius. They rarely come in the moment we think they will. We expect them to arrive in a flash. The big fight, the betrayal, the sudden revelation. But more often, they come in the still moments, the spaces between words, when something inside us finally admits, I don't want to try anymore. You didn't leave because you hated them. You didn't leave because you wanted to hurt them. You left because you saw with perfect clarity that no amount of explaining, fixing, or proving would make you feel at home there again. You realized you could sit beside them and still feel alone, and loneliness in the presence of someone you love is the heaviest kind. I once met a woman named Isla who told me about the night she knew her marriage was over. There was no fight, no affair, no shouting, just the two of them sitting in the living room watching a show they used to love. And suddenly she realized she hadn't laughed in months. She looked at her husband, and she didn't see a villain. She saw someone who was no longer walking the same path as her. It was like realizing I'd been speaking a language he no longer understood, she said. The next day, she started quietly packing her things. Sagittarius, that's what happened to you. The karmic tie didn't break because of a grand act. It dissolved because you stopped feeding it. And the moment you stopped feeding it, it stopped being able to hold you. There is a deep, often unspoken grief in this kind of ending. It's not the grief of being wronged. It's the grief of recognizing that love, no matter how sincere, isn't always enough to keep two souls moving together. But there's also a strange relief in it. The relief of no longer having to fight for something that was quietly draining you. This is where people often misunderstand you. They think that if you're not leaving in anger, you must still want to stay. They assume that if there's no big blow-up, you'll be back. But they don't understand that the quiet endings are the ones you never return from. Because once your soul has made peace with the truth, there's nothing left to go back to. Your decision wasn't a reaction, it was a revelation. And revelations can't be undone. The lesson here is one that many never learn. Not every ending has to be loud to be final. Sometimes the most powerful exits are the ones made in silence, without needing the other person to see your worth in order to walk away. Sometimes the truest strength is in closing the door softly, knowing that you will never open it again. Not because of bitterness, but because of clarity. And that clarity, Sagittarius, is the beginning of a freedom that doesn't need to be proven to anyone but yourself. Gate 3, the weight lifted and there was no regret. You thought it would hurt, Sagittarius. You thought that closing the karmic door would feel like ripping something vital from your chest, that you'd be left gasping in the emptiness that followed. After all, that's what you'd always imagined endings to be: loss, grief, a raw wound you'd carry for months. But when you finally stepped through, there was no collapse, no desperate urge to turn back. There was only a stillness you hadn't felt in years. It was as if you'd been carrying a backpack filled with stones. Stones you convinced yourself you had to bear because they were part of love. Every disappointment, every moment of over-explaining yourself, every silent night when you felt unseen. You packed it all in and shouldered the weight without question. But the moment you set it down, you realized just how heavy it had been. And here's the surprising thing. You didn't need to rehearse what you would say if they called. You didn't need to scroll through old messages to remind yourself why you'd left. You didn't even need to tell anyone else to validate your choice. The peace spoke for itself. That's when you began to see the truth. The memories, the promises, the "we'll try harder next time" moments, they were never chains. They were simply pages in a chapter that had run its course. You could look at them now without the ache of longing. They were still beautiful in their own way, but they no longer tempted you to go back. I remember speaking to a man named Elias, who had walked away from a relationship after 10 years. When I asked him if he regretted leaving, he smiled in a way that was both soft and unshakable. "No," he said, "because I realized that staying would have meant I was betraying myself every day. I wasn't leaving her. I was leaving the version of me who thought I had to explain my worth to be loved." That's the shift you've stepped into, Sagittarius. You no longer need them to understand your choice. You no longer need a clean ending wrapped in mutual closure. You no longer crave the satisfaction of proving you were right. The act of walking away, of choosing yourself without the need for explanation, is the closure. And with that choice comes a lightness that's almost intoxicating. You wake up and your chest doesn't ache. You go through your day and you're not scanning the crowd for their face. You no longer feel that reflexive tug in your spirit that says, "Maybe I should check in just in case." The cord is gone, and with it, the constant hum of anxiety you'd learned to live with. That lightness is not the absence of love. It's the presence of freedom. And freedom changes everything. You find yourself smiling more. Even when you're alone, you take deeper breaths. You feel your mind returning to things you'd neglected. Passions, friendships, dreams you put on hold because you were too busy carrying someone else's emotional weight. Here's the lesson that rises from all this. You don't need to win the argument to walk away whole. You don't need the final word. You don't need to prove the story in your heart. The real victory is in knowing that you chose peace over the endless need to explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you. Sagittarius, this is the gift of the karmic door closing. You are free not because you were released, but because you released yourself. And once you've felt the air of that freedom, no amount of nostalgia can pull you back into the old room. Gate for a new version of you is being born. When the karmic door closed, Sagittarius, it didn't just end a relationship. It ended an entire chapter of your life, and with it, a version of you that had carried certain habits, beliefs, and wounds for far too long. For years, you were the one who overextended. You were the emotional anchor in storms you didn't create. You were the steady light for people who had no intention of tending to their own flame. You told yourself that was love, to keep giving, even when it left you empty, to keep forgiving, even when it cost you your peace. And you weren't wrong in thinking that love gives. But you've now learned the truth that love cannot thrive without balance, and that light, when given without boundaries, can burn the one who carries it. Closing the karmic door marked the end of that pattern, not because you have become hardened or cynical, but because you finally understand that your tenderness is sacred, and sacred things deserve protection. Now, your love is no longer limitless in the way it once was. It's not that you love less, you simply love with awareness. You give, but only from a place where giving doesn't deplete you. You forgive, but you no longer confuse forgiveness with access. You listen deeply, but you no longer feel responsible for fixing the chaos in someone else's soul. It's a subtle but powerful shift. You are no longer driven by the need to prove your worth through sacrifice. You are driven by the desire to protect the wholeness you've worked so hard to reclaim. I remember speaking with a woman named Mireille who, after leaving a deeply karmic relationship, told me she felt as though she had been reborn into her own skin. She didn't become tougher in the way people expected. She didn't shut herself off from connection. She didn't build high walls. Instead, she kept her heart soft, but she learned to place it in hands that could hold it with care. "I didn't become cold," she said. "I became precise with my warmth." That's where you are now, Sagittarius. This new version of you doesn't need to chase, convince, or overextend. You show up fully, but only in spaces where your presence is respected and reciprocated. You let people in, but you no longer keep the door open for those who walk in only to take. You have become intentional about where your energy flows, and that intention is changing everything. And here's the most beautiful part. The people who meet you now meet the real you, unfiltered by the need to be someone's savior. They meet the you who stands in her own center, radiating light because she chooses to, not because she's trying to fill someone else's darkness. They meet the you who can say no without guilt, yes without fear, and goodbye without breaking. This is evolution in its purest form, not the kind that hardens you into stone, but the kind that refines you into something unshakable and luminous. You are still tender. You are still open. But you are no longer unguarded. You are the guardian of your own energy now, and that makes you unstoppable. The karmic door didn't just close, Sagittarius. It sealed shut behind you, ensuring that the old version of you, the one who overgave, who carried too much, who mistook pain for depth, cannot be resurrected. And in her place stands someone new, softer, wiser, and infinitely more powerful. Conclusion: you've walked through and there's no need to look back. Sagittarius, this time you didn't turn around. You didn't pause to see if they were watching you leave. You didn't keep the door cracked in case they decided to follow. You walked through, and the sound of that karmic door closing behind you was not a loss. It was a liberation. This isn't because you stopped loving. It's because you loved enough to know when love had become a tether instead of a home. You loved yourself enough to recognize that peace is worth more than being understood. You've learned that endings are not punishments, but thresholds, and stepping through them doesn't mean you're abandoning something. It means you're choosing what's next. The beauty of this moment is that you no longer need closure from anyone else. You no longer wait for an apology to feel whole. You no longer measure your worth by whether someone regrets losing you. That weight is gone. What remains is a steady light inside you that belongs to you alone. And the path ahead? It's wide open. The karmic cycle that once kept you circling the same emotional ground has dissolved, and in its place is the freedom to write a new story. One where you don't have to prove your place in someone's life. One where love arrives as a natural exchange, not as a prize you have to earn. The truth is, they may never fully understand why you left. They may never see the moment it all shifted for you. And that's okay. They don't need to. You don't need them to. Understanding was never the point, liberation was. So keep walking, Sagittarius. Walk into the spaces where your energy is cherished. Walk toward the connections that feel effortless. Walk into the mornings where you wake without the heaviness of wondering if you're enough for someone to stay. Because you've done the hardest part. You've closed the karmic door without hesitation, without anger, without regret. And that act, quiet, intentional, final, is the mark of someone who has been reborn. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of the most unshakable, radiant chapter of your life. And the only direction now is forward.